So, hello and welcome to the second presentation in our webinar series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Daniel Hogan. I'm the chairman of CIWEM Northern Ireland. As I said in our previous presentations, the purpose of this lunchtime series is to complement the 2020-2021 technical programme with the programme theme for the year, which is Water and the Environment, Adapting to Change. So today's presentation is titled Peat Restoration in Ireland, and hopefully we'll demonstrate how the view of peatlands are changing in Ireland. So today's presentation will hopefully provide an outline of the importance of peat conservation and management and its potential for use as a nature-based method in the context of integrated catchment management, and also outline some of the key drivers for peatland restoration and the innovative techniques that are being applied across the range of peatlands in Ireland. So before I introduce our speaker, I'm going to go through a few points of housekeeping. The first is this event is being recorded, so keep your microphones on mute. This event will be made available on the CIWEM website and also on the CIWEM YouTube page, which is worth subscribing to because it contains all past events and a range of topics from all branches across the group. If you experience any technical issues and the need for assistance, please use the chat feature on Zoom to let us know what the problem is, and we'll provide help if required. So we'll be taking all questions at the end. So if you want to ask a question, please do so. Please feel free to use the Q&A facility of Zoom, and I'll ask them at the end, a range of questions. So also this event is counts for an hour of CPD. However, CIWEM do not offer any CPD certificates. So anyway, our speaker for today is Francis Mackin of RPS. A little bit about Francis. He's a senior associate in the Water Environment Division of RPS in Belfast. He holds a degree in environmental management and a master's in environmental engineering from Queen's University. He is a chartered water and environmental manager, a chartered scientist, and a chartered environmentalist. Francis leads a team of engineers and scientists involved in the conservation and management of peatlands, including raised bogs and blanket bogs across Ireland. He has led in the development of detailed hydrological restoration plans for a variety of peatland sites for clients, including the National Parks and Wildlife Service, the EU Life-funded Living Bog Project, Bord na Móna, Birdwatch Ireland, and Ulster Wildlife, to name just a few. So over to you, Francis.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks very much, and thanks to the CIWEM NI branch for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all today. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what's happening in peat restoration across Ireland, and hopefully get some discussion going at the end. Just to say that a lot of the work that we do in RPS is in collaboration with Queen's University Belfast, particularly Dr. Ray Flynn, and a lot of the projects that we work on, we collaborate together and hopefully get the best scientific outcome in terms of all of our projects. So you'll see reference to Ray Flynn throughout the presentation as well as some of my colleagues in the Belfast office. So what are peatlands? Well, peatlands cover quite a significant portion of the island of Ireland. Over 16% of the island of Ireland is covered in some form of peatlands. And we have three main categories. We have our blanket bogs, our raised bogs, and our fens. And our blanket bogs form the most significant portion of our peatlands across Ireland, and would make up about 67% of the original area of peatlands that would have covered the country. Raised bogs cover a smaller portion of 25% and mostly confined to the Midlands, with a band of them sort of stretching up through the sort of mid Ulster and down across it through County Clare and North Kerry. And our fens, which typically would have been, I suppose, associated with very low-lying areas and would be different to our blanket bogs and raised bogs in that they are groundwater fed, whereas our blanket bogs and raised bogs are ombrotrophic and source all of their water and their nutrients from rainfall. So just to give you an idea, our blanket bogs as the name suggests, they blanket the landscape, and they typically occur in areas where we have over 1,250 millimeters of rainfall per year. So that's in the uplands and along the western seaboard at lower levels. And that's where we get our Atlantic blanket bog. We have our raised bogs, which typically are confined to, would have been confined to basins and then grown a dome that was elevated above the surroundings, hence the name raised bog. So the focus today is very much going to be on our blanket bogs and raised bogs. And given, I suppose, some of my experience in raised bogs, you're going to see a bit of a bias towards raised bogs in some of the slides coming up. So if we look at rainfall across Ireland, you can see very close correlation between where we get very high levels of rainfall and where we get blanket bog, and then that central Midland basin where we get our raised bogs forming. And we do have transitions between them and subcategories where we have true Midland types in areas of lower rainfall through to intermediate transitional types that occur further west as rainfall increases. So why are our peatlands important? Well, these habitats, these peatland habitats are really unique. They're really rare globally. They occur in relatively few places. 3% of the total landmass of the world is made up of peatlands, and a fairly significant proportion of that across Europe has been very badly damaged. And we're quite lucky in Ireland that we still retain relatively good areas of peatland habitat, both raised bog and blanket bogs. So when we talk about biological diversity, these are areas that don't have a lot of variation in the different types of plant species that occur. They have relatively small number of specialist plants that grow in these conditions, very waterlogged and acidic water with very low nutrient levels. But these are plants that really don't grow in a lot of locations, and we have an obligation to protect and enhance these areas. But not only the peatlands themselves, they also support downstream flows. So some of our aquatic species, such as the freshwater pearl mussel, are very heavily reliant on getting that sustained flow of very clean water flowing across these areas, maintaining flows during times of low flow, and making sure that species such as this that are critically endangered can survive. We have other species such as the curlew and a range of other bird species that are heavily reliant on these areas. And we also rely on a lot of these areas for drinking water. So this is an example of the Dungonal Reservoir up in County Antrim that's surrounded by blanket bog. It's an area owned by NI Water, and we rely on these areas for very clean drinking water. And also they attenuate our flows. So they can have quite a significant effect in terms of flooding, particularly where the peatlands have been very badly damaged in the past. They hold records of our archaeological history. So this is an example of Corlay bog track, Tohur from I think it's around 150 BC that's been preserved down in the peat. And these are things that are just wouldn't be preserved if our peatlands were completely destroyed and completely neglected. And obviously, as time has went on, we've come to find a new appreciation of our peatlands, and they're increasingly being used as a source of education, recreation, and amenity use. So this is a really nice example of a boardwalk in a site in County Laois, Abbey Lakes Bog, and it's a site that's used quite a lot by the local community. It was a site that would have been proposed for industrial peat extraction by Bord na Móna in the past, and Bord na Móna with the community group actually went back in and blocked the drains, and now it's become a really popular location. So what's our problem with our peatlands? Well, for a start, drainage has been ongoing for centuries, both in terms of trying to improve the productivity of these lands, to improve grazing, to mark out areas of plots for peat extraction. So a lot of our raised bogs in particular would have been lost to hand and extraction of peat in the past. And more recently, that has been replaced with mechanized turf cutting, particularly in the Midlands of Ireland. And this has resulted in areas of peat being lost, but also a very significant drainage effect that extends right back into the bog. We've had industrial peat extraction. So, for example, companies such as Ammonia have used these areas to extract peat for fuel and horticulture. And this has left large areas of our country with, I suppose, a lot of bare peat. We have had issues with overgrazing, and this has led to erosion across many parts of our peatlands, particularly in the uplands. We've had invasives such as rhododendron that have come in and taken over in particular locations. And more recent problems include ammonia. This is associated with agriculture and has a very significant effect on these areas that are very low in nutrients and rely on very low nutrient water supply. And there's a number of examples across the country where peatlands have been very significantly damaged with ammonia emissions. And forestry, which has been a problem for both our raised bogs and our blanket bogs, which requires drainage for the planting to take place and lowers the water table of the peat, and the trees themselves, which increase rates of interception and evapotranspiration. So we have a whole host of problems. Just to name a few, we have other issues such as burning, which is carried out sometimes for management, but often it can be accidental or even deliberate burning of our peatland areas. In more recent times, we've seen an increase in the number of bog bursts, and this is an example of Mean Bog in County Donegal, where a large peat slide resulted in huge impacts on the downstream watercourse and is continuing to have impacts and will require a very significant restoration strategy to deal with this issue. And it's one of a number of bog slides that have occurred in the recent past. So just focusing a little on our active raised bogs. And when I talk about active raised bogs, I'm talking about the areas of these raised bogs that are still accumulating peat. So there's still a net sort of gain in terms of the carbon that's being sequestered compared to the carbon that's released, both through our dissolved organic carbon releases and also methane releases. And if you look at the map on the left, which is the map I showed earlier, and the areas in pink are our original extent of raised bogs that would have covered the country. In the Republic of Ireland, they would have covered 310,000 hectares originally. And today, just 1,659 hectares are considered actively peat accumulating raised bogs in the Republic of Ireland. And you probably can't even see it, but there are little red dots, and they represent the areas that are still considered to be peat accumulating. So something very significant has happened. Something has caused very substantial loss of our active raised bog. And just to show you what I mean by active raised bog, this is an example of central Ecotope, which is the mapping system that's used in the Republic of Ireland. And this would represent the best quality active raised bog habitat. There's good diversity in terms of the microtopography. There's a very good range of species, and the water table is pretty much at the surface all year round. Compared to the margins of the site where the water table is quite low, the surface is quite hard, and there's very little variation in that microtopography. So what are the policy drivers that are pushing us towards peatland restoration? Well, some of them have been around for quite a while, going back to the Ramsar Convention back in 1975. And since then, we've had a number of additional conventions and EU directives that have pushed us towards peatland restoration, including the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Habitats Directive, the Water Framework Directive. And more recent, I suppose, drivers have included the impact that our peatlands can have in terms of climate change. So these areas typically are net carbon sequestration areas. So they typically take in more carbon than they release through either methane or DOC. But once they're drained and once that water table is dropped, that pattern is reversed. And with increasing recognition of the importance of climate change, our peatlands have been seen as a potential solution to reduce emissions, particularly in areas where there are very high emissions from either bare peat or drain soils that are used for agriculture. And there are a number of additional policy drivers, including the National Climate Action Plan in the Republic of Ireland. But ultimately, the EU has been a big driver of peatland restoration in Ireland. And in the Republic of Ireland, an infringement case was brought against Ireland back in 2011. And this is something that is still ongoing to this day. But Ireland has made great strides towards developing a national peatland strategy, a national raised bog SAC management plan. The UK have developed their own peatland strategy and the climate action plan. So all of these mean that across the island of Ireland, there's a much greater focus on peatland restoration in recent years. So just to highlight some of the projects that have fallen out from these policy drivers, there are e-life funded projects such as the Living Bog, which is restoring 12 raised bogs across the Irish Midlands. There's Interreg projects, the CAN project, the CAB project, the Peat project, all of which are working to restore peatlands, including raised bogs, blanket bogs and fens. National Parks and Wildlife Service in the Republic of Ireland have implemented a raised bog restoration programme that is looking to fast track the implementation of raised bog restoration that was set out within the National Raised Bog SSE Management Plan. Ulster Wildlife, NI Water, Source to Tap, these are all projects and organisations that are involved in peatland restoration. And some recent developments have included the LIFE IP programme, the Wild Atlantic Nature project, which will look at restoring blanket bogs across the west of Ireland. And a very significant one here on the right of the screen, which is, I suppose, the shift for an organisation like Bord na Móna that has very recently decided to formally end all of their peat harvesting operations. And they've also agreed a climate action programme for peatland restoration, funded 108 million direct from government and 18 million from Bord na Móna, and that's going to target 33,000 hectares of our raised bogs for restoration. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So I suppose one of the key issues in terms of peatland restoration is hydrology. And in the case of raised bogs, we need a nutrient poor water supply, and that requires our water table to be very close to the ground surface all year round, which requires appropriate amounts of rainfall coming in throughout the year, and also the frequency of that rainfall to be distributed adequately throughout the year. It's no good if it rains for 10 months of the year and then it's completely dry for 2 months of the year. So this is why our raised bogs are particularly sensitive to the potential impacts of climate change. We need very low rates of infiltration down through the peat, and that limits the amount of water that's lost to depth. Now, in the past, raised bogs and blanket bogs, to an extent, were often considered to be isolated from their geological surroundings, and the impact of infiltration through the peat was often neglected. But recent research, particularly work that people like Shane Regan has done on Clara Bog, has showed that these bogs are very, very much groundwater dependent and very much rely on the regional groundwater regime. And the other key factor that we need is very gentle topographic gradients on our raised bogs. Our blanket bogs can be sustained on steeper slopes, but our surface slope is a very key factor in how these sites are maintained. So in terms of raised bogs, what we've been able to do is to use LiDAR data that we've collected for a range of sites, and we've been able to develop a hydrological model that predicts the area of the bog that is considered to have suitable hydrological conditions for active raised bog formation. And this is just a summary of how the model works. It's basically based on surface slope, so where the ground surface slope is between 0.3 and 0.6%, and that all depends on the rate of effective rainfall. Where we have more effective rainfall, the slope can be slightly steeper, but where we have less effective rainfall, that slope has to be less than that 0.3% threshold. And that's a very gentle surface slope. That's 30 centimeters change in elevation over 100 meters. So it's something that's very difficult to pick up with the naked eye. So we need very gentle surface slopes across our raised bogs for active raised bog to be maintained. And the exception to that is in areas where we have very focused flow. So where we have a lot of flow converging together, they're the areas where active raised bog can form a slightly steeper slope. So this approach of modeling our raised bogs and understanding where we can get peat accumulating conditions helps us to enable prioritization of where we want to invest. Where are we going to get the most value in terms of peatland restoration, most value in terms of active raised bog restored with the investment that we're going to put in. And this is just an example of Corbo Bog in County Roscommon. And the map on the left shows the Ecotope map that I mentioned earlier, the ecological mapping system that's used in the Republic of Ireland. And the pink and red areas represent the active raised bog, the areas that are still peat accumulating. The areas in red would be the best quality active raised bog vegetation. And the image on the right shows the model conditions. So the areas that we consider that have suitable conditions for active raised bog to form. And we can see that there's good overlap, and we have the potential to expand these areas through restoration measures. What maps like this would show us is that in areas like this that are quite isolated, our potential to restore these areas to active raised bog is much more limited. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't invest in restoration in these areas, because it depends on what the focus of our restoration measure is. We still can get benefits in terms of reducing carbon emissions, in terms of wider biodiversity benefits, and also impacts including improving water quality or reducing the rate of runoff from a particular site. So as I mentioned, we have to have a wider understanding of the hydrogeological setting of these sites and how they operate in order to be able to set realistic restoration targets. So this is an example of a raised bog where there was a proposal for drainage to take place on the adjacent site. And we have superimposed the level of the proposed drainage and been able to model the impacts in terms of what would happen if that drainage took place. And at present, what you can see with the green line is that there's a groundwater mound between the two sites. So the two sites at present are considered hydrogeologically isolated. But if this drainage takes place, the groundwater mound would reduce significantly. And the orange and red line outline two potential scenarios. The red would be a more extreme scenario depending on the rate of flow through this till substrate, and that all depends on the hydraulic conductivity of the peat. So we were able to use techniques such as ERT, or electrical resistivity tomography, to determine what the substrate layers were underneath the peat and be able to come up with this model to predict what the impacts can be. So we have to understand how these sites are set in our landscape, and we have to understand that what we do in our catchments can have a significant impacts on these peatlands and our general wetlands in our landscape. So since developing the modelling approaches for raised bogs, I've been working with Queen's University Belfast through the Cubes project and Dr. Ray Flynn in expanding this research to look at blanket bog. And what you can see here is a couple of examples of some of our trial sites, blanket bog sites, where we have applied the same hydrological model in terms of surface slope and catchment area to predict what the conditions are like on these sites. Now, there are significant differences between raised bogs and blanket bogs, so a number of model modifications have had to be made. in order to make this model work. And that includes accounting for things like stream flow and peat pipes. And what these images show would basically be the areas in purple would indicate the wet areas where we would expect to see a stable and high water table throughout the year. And the darker brown areas would be the areas where we would expect to see much more fluctuations in the water table. So this is some ongoing research at present, but it's showing good potential. We have hydrological monitoring data from each of these sites over a period of 2.5 years, and it's showing that the model is relatively good at predicting where those areas of highest water table are likely to be. And what this allows us to do is focus our restoration effort. We can apply this to sites that have been very badly damaged and then predict where we should focus our investment. So just in terms of developing restoration plans, the way that we go about that is to use LiDAR data initially. And LiDAR data gives us a good indication of the topography of the site. And we're able to use that to undertake the hydrological modeling to identify where the areas of highest restoration potential are and allow us to prioritize where the restoration measures should be focused. We then follow that up with some field surveys to go out and ground truth what's happening on each of these sites and make sure that we haven't missed any drains or missed any particular issues, and also to get an idea of what's going on in terms of the substrate underneath the peat and whether we have potential for groundwater issues in terms of increased infiltration through the peat. So this is an example of Scohopoy Bog NHA down in County Tipperary. This is the site that we developed the restoration plan for on behalf of National Parks and Wildlife Service. So you can see it's quite varied in terms of the range of measures, including drain blocking with peat and plastic dams, felling of some coniferous forestry in the cutover areas, building bunds on the high bog and also on the cutover areas, and I suppose some general maintenance activities, including clearance of scrub. Some of the more enhanced measures that have come about over recent years, and again, have improved in their design through the use of hydrological modeling and also the use of LiDAR data to predict where these measures are most likely to be effective, is the construction of marginal bunds. And this is an example of Killyconny Bog down in County Cavan. And this bund was constructed right along the edge of the cutover bog that surrounds the high bog. So the bit that where peat extraction has happened in the past. And this was 2008, relatively soon after the berm was constructed. And this is 2014. And what we've seen at this site has been a substantial increase in the peat forming habitats that have occurred on the cutover bog. So really in a relatively short time period, it's went from bare peat to very high sphagnum cover, which is one of the key building blocks of our raised bogs. And what we've seen is movement towards what we were calling active raised bog, that peat accumulating vegetation type. And this is something that we've been able to learn from and work with the Living Bog project at Ardegullion Bog and design a similar type bund using LiDAR data to determine where the most optimum placement of that bund would be. Together, myself and Dr. Hugh Cushnan, one of my colleagues, would have worked on this. And you can see very quickly the water levels started to rise. So what we're targeting in these areas is very shallow depths of water. We don't want deep water across these areas because deep water does not favour sphagnum formation. So at most we're looking at water depths of around 20 centimetres, but typically between ground surface and 20 centimetres above ground. And this was 2019, and within a year, this area has really started to colonize very rapidly with sphagnum, and there's very good results, which suggest that it's on a similar trajectory to Killyconny Bog. Again, what we've been able to do with the hydrological monitoring information that we have and the likes of the LiDAR data is to apply the same type of analysis to a range of sites. And what we've been looking at have been techniques such as cell bunding. So again, this is an example with National Parks and Wildlife Service that we've worked on in collaboration with Ammonia, and it's also one of the Peat sites. And this is a proposal that I've developed in terms of outlining where bunds should be placed along the cutover to maximize a number of benefits, including habitat restoration, but also looking at wider biodiversity, maximizing benefits for carbon. So reducing the current carbon emissions that there would be a net carbon emission from this cutover area, and trying to turn that into a carbon sink, trying to improve flow attenuation, improve water quality, and also this is an area that is very popular with locals in Turrell's Pass, so it's used quite a lot for amenity and recreation, as well as tourism and education. And this is an example of a project that really hits all of those ecosystem services benefits. And just in terms of how this has been designed, again, keeping the water levels very close to the ground surface. So you can see towards the outer cells, the water depths are potentially up to 20 centimeters in places, but in a lot of cases, it's just about getting the water table very close to the ground surface. And this is an image just showing the bunds after construction, and they've been working extremely well at retaining a very shallow depth of water. So moving on to our blanket bogs, we face a number of different challenges there. We have the same issues in terms of drainage and going in and blocking drains. Typically with peat dams is the go-to measure. Sometimes we would be proposing things like timber dams or plastic dams where the flows are too excessive for peat and where there's a very severe risk of erosion. But what we face with our blanket bogs in a lot of cases is very severe erosion. A lot of times this is associated with past activities, including very high density of grazing. And this is an example of Quilca Mountain in County Fermanagh, the project that we worked on with the CAN project and Ulster Wildlife. And what we were able to do there was use the LiDAR data to identify where the measures were required in terms of reprofiling the edges of these peat hags to reduce the carbon emissions, and also identify locations of coir dams so that we can slow the flow and start to promote this bare peat getting revegetated. So again, this is a project that I would have worked with one of my colleagues, Dr. Laura McNallen, and we would have identified what the measures were and been able to provide a very detailed scope to the client that they were able to use for tendering processes. So you can just see the work as it was being carried out, the reprofiling of the hags, removing that bare peat and just smoothing that topography down, and then placing vegetation on top of these eroded areas to reduce carbon emissions. And again, just standard drain blocking with peat dams. And something that's quite exciting that I mentioned earlier is the Peatlands and Climate Action Scheme by Bord na Móna. So this is a fairly recent development with Bord na Móna moving away from peat extraction across their sites, and really peatland rehabilitation becoming one of their core activities. So this project is funded to the tune of 126 million euro, and it will focus on their deep peat sites and areas where they can rehabilitate wetlands. And 33,000 hectares of our peatlands will be rehabilitated through this project. So you can see in the map outlined in red and yellow are our designated sites. So red are our SSEs and yellow are our NHAs. And these are sites that are designated for raised bog habitats. And you can see around the Midlands of Ireland. So this focuses east of the Shannon. And you can see there are vast tracts of areas of raised bog that would have been extracted in the past and will now undergo very substantial rehabilitation. So hopefully we'll be seeing areas like that currently look like something like this, moving into something a bit more like what we had seen at Killyconny Bog with very substantial sphagnum cover. So just, I suppose that was a quick whistle-stop tour, but I suppose the point I was trying to make through this is that peatlands form quite a significant portion of our landscape in Ireland, and they're an extremely valuable feature. And that value is increasingly starting to be recognised, not just by governments and government departments, but also by the wider public. And there's been a real shift in public perception of these sites and their importance. So restoration has the potential to provide a wide variety of ecosystem services benefits, and that's not just limited to restoring these very unique habitats, but also wider biodiversity benefits, carbon, water quality, and water quantity regulation. And really, to achieve all of these benefits, what we need is a multidisciplinary approach. So it's not good enough for a hydrologist like myself to go off and decide a restoration proposal, or an ecologist to do the same. Everyone has to work together to get the most benefits out of what we're trying to achieve. So in order to achieve these multiple ecosystem services benefits, a multidisciplinary approach is definitely key. And thanks very much for your attention, and be happy to take any questions you might have.
Very good, Francis. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that presentation. I'm sure everyone is in the same boat. A couple of questions came in during, a few of them were starting to come in. But I suppose I'll kick off the questioning with, hopefully it's not too much of a difficult one, but you had mentioned that a number of different techniques have been used for blanket bog and raised bog restoration. How would you measure whether restoration is considered successful for the projects that you've been involved in?
Yeah, that's a good question. It really depends on what the purpose of restoration is for. So in the context of restoring a special area of conservation, a site that's designated for active raised bog or active blanket bog, the focus very much has to be on, have you met the targets in terms of restored that area of active raised bog that you think is feasible. So what we do with the work that we do with raised bogs and blanket bogs is try to predict what are we likely to see, focus our restoration measures, and then undertake monitoring to try to see, has that actually achieved what we were expecting. So ecological monitoring is something that takes quite a bit of time. So going out and doing quadrats, or going and doing vegetation surveys, it can take up to 10 years before you start to see those changes in ecology. So what we can do is use proxy tools. So things like using piezometers to measure the water level in the peat before, during, and after restoration, and see, has the restoration work restored that water table that we would expect to see, and also look at other factors such as water quality, or maybe the flow from the site, and see, have those elements changed, or are we seeing the trend towards the right direction of what we would expect to see.
Very good. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to touch on another question. You had touched on the hydrological modelling of raised bogs, and from looking at the various images and comparing the ecological surveys versus the model outputs are very impressive and very similar. But just, can you expand on what the key parameters are of the model and how they're developed, and how is it useful?
Yeah, so the model itself is based largely on the use of LiDAR data. So it goes back to research that was carried out back in the 1990s by the Irish-Dutch Raised Bog project. And that was a fantastic project that brought together, I talk about a multidisciplinary approach. That was really a perfect example of a multidisciplinary approach, the way in which that project was carried out. There was a range of people working together with different backgrounds and different expertise. So the model builds on some research that was carried out through that project that found that there was a very strong relationship between the Ecotope, basically the vegetation type, and surface slope and flow patterns. So where you have a very gentle surface slope, there's a very strong relationship with hydraulic gradient, or very simply how rapidly water's likely to run off the site. And then also the bigger your catchment area, the more flow, the more sustained flow you're likely to have through a particular area. So it's built on that research, but updated with new tools such as GIS and the use of LiDAR data, where we have very high resolution data across these sites. And what we've been able to do is use the Ecotope data that has been prepared for each of the sites by National Parks and Wildlife Service, and identify the range of conditions in terms of surface slope and catchment area that's required to achieve certain ecotopes, and also take into account meteorological conditions. So as I mentioned, moving east to west, there's an increase in the rate of effective rainfall. So we can sustain higher water levels in areas that have more frequent and higher levels of rainfall. So the model itself is based on using those parameters, and then allows us to target where is most effective in terms of restoration, so where we most likely to get bang for our buck.
Very good. Now, I suppose I'll touch on a couple of questions that have been asked by our participants here. Can you suggest the best source of advice on restoration of smaller areas, say 30 acres of non-designated raised bogs in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, and that's something that's really been coming about more and more. And I've been coming across more and more community groups that are interested in restoration and just want to know more about it. And you know, when you're dealing with those smaller areas, sometimes it can be a bit more difficult. There's more issues in terms of neighbours and land ownership and things, so it can be difficult. But I would say, in the case, certainly in the case of the Republic of Ireland, there's a great organisation called the Community Wetlands Forum, and they are a group of very small community groups that have all come together and work with organisations like National Parks and Wildlife Service, Board Ammonia, and have found a way of finding technical expertise to inform their restoration projects. I'm not sure if there's something similar in Northern Ireland, but I know that they're very interested in cross-border collaboration. So it might be something that is worth contacting the Community Wetlands Forum and seeing if there's any interest. Otherwise, your best port of call is likely to be organisations such as Ulster Wildlife or RSPB, who are very interested in peatland restoration at the moment.
Yeah, very good. Lots of questions come in. Mona Cowman, how does Board of Mona benefit from restoration? Government subsidies? Question mark. Is that?
Yeah, so I suppose Board of Mona have an obligation under their license. So they're licensed to, they would have been licensed to extract peat in the sites that they worked in. And one of the conditions of their license would have been you have to rehabilitate the site post extraction. So in terms of the figures that I mentioned, the 108 million that comes direct from government and the 18 million that is coming from Board of Mona, my understanding of it is that the 18 million would cover the standard rehabilitation that they would have carried out anyway. So very much their rehabilitation under their license agreement would be about stabilizing the site and probably, you know, improving biodiversity. So particular focus would have been about reducing the peat silt loss from the site. So it would have been going in, blocking drains, potentially constructing some berms. Whereas this new approach, where the funding's coming direct from government, there's very much a climate focus on this. So there's a recognition that these peatland areas have a very significant role to play in climate regulation and in terms of Ireland's emissions. So government recognises that and is expecting Board of Mona to improve what they would have done under the standard license agreements and really target carbon sequestration as much as possible across these sites. So I suppose the benefit for Board of Mona there from getting this money is that transition, moving a workforce that would have traditionally been out extracting peat, and all of a sudden that peat extraction has ended, moving those people onto a rehabilitation scheme where they're leaving the landscape in a much better condition than would have been the case.
Very good. A question from Claire Vincent. Thank you, Francis. Great presentation. Over the years of working in this area, where have you been most encouraged by nature's capacity for recovery?
It's a good question, Claire. It's actually it's amazing how much nature can do itself. So there are some sites that I've been on. There's one in particular, Cowbehy Bog, down in County Roscommon. And if you were dropped into the center of this area, you would think that you were in an expanse of completely intact, untouched raised bog. And in reality, what you're standing on is about 30 centimeters of peat. And this peat would have been extracted over the centuries through hand extraction, and this would be the residual peat that remains. But simply because there weren't large deep drains in the area, and there wasn't any human intervention or any arterial drainage or deep drainage schemes in the area, this area has recovered substantially and now looks like some of the best quality active raised bog habitat that you could find. So nature can definitely do a lot itself, as long as you ensure that there's not those factors such as drainage that are always going to have an impact if nothing's done about it.
Very good. There's loads and loads of questions here. It's very difficult to just pick on a few, and I'm conscious of the time. I don't want to be eating into too many people's lunch hour, but there was one from Owen Williams. Why are core materials like coconut husk being used in dam construction? Is it more effective than locally sourced materials, i.e. wood, hay bales, etc.?
Yeah, it's again a good question, and something that where it's sometimes quite difficult to get the balance right. One of the reasons that coir is used in restoring areas that are very badly degraded is that other materials tend to break down quite quickly. So things like heather bales, you have to extract the heather from somewhere, so you're having an impact somewhere else, and then putting the heather in place tends to break down much more rapidly, tends to have issues with grazing from animals. So coir definitely seems to be one of the better materials. There are issues in terms of obviously the carbon costs with importing that material and then how it's transported up to sites. In a lot of cases, helicopters have to be used because it's not realistic to take it back and forward either with a quad or any other means. These areas typically are very difficult to get at. But ultimately, my understanding of it is that there's quite detailed studies out there that show that the carbon benefits from doing this work and putting these materials in place will offset quite quickly the carbon cost with actually bringing in these materials. Certainly things like timber can be used, and where they're an effective approach, they should possibly be used, ahead of something like coir. But definitely there's a balancing act with things like that.
Very good. I'm just going to take two more questions, if that's all right, Francis. Let me see. Oh, golly, a couple of. Oh, here's one. The biodiversity from Richard Andrews. The biodiversity recovery in the examples given is very encouraging. From a carbon capture perspective, is it both removing drainage and reinstating biodiversity that is needed to avoid carbon release? Is that a
So your most benefit in terms of carbon sequestration is where you can get those active peat accumulating conditions back again. So where you can get the carbon actually, or the peat basically forming again and bringing in that carbon. You're always going to have methane emissions and losses through DOC, but if the peat's accumulating, you will have a net benefit from that peat that's accumulating. So your ideal scenario is getting to that, but you have to be realistic about what you can get. And some of those examples that I've showed, yes, they are, say for example, some of the Bundan, they're areas that had bare peat that, really were very badly degraded and would have been fairly significant carbon sources. And that has been changed, but that's not realistic for absolutely everywhere, particularly on the uncut portion of the bog. So sometimes you have to accept that maybe just raising that water table and reducing the rate of oxidation is the best that you can do. And it's more about offsetting emissions in that scenario, or sorry, reducing emissions in that scenario rather than actually getting it to be a net carbon sink.
And I think I'm just going to take one last question, and apologies to all of the people who have asked questions. I can't just get to it. We'll be here all day, but I suppose the last one relating to flooding: has the impact of peatland restoration on flood mitigation been modelled?
It has been modelled in a number of cases. So say, for example, in the case of the CIWEM study in Ireland, there was consideration of how the Board-na-Mono peatlands could impact on flooding of the Shannon. And in that scenario, you're dealing with a huge catchment. And even with these vast areas, the impact that has on flood peaks is relatively limited in that capacity. But where you've got smaller catchments, or where you've got these very flashy catchments and they're very badly degraded, there's a lot of studies that have modeled and then subsequently showed that through peatland restoration, you've reduced that peak flow. So your most significant benefits would be where you're going from a situation where there's very substantial drainage and a lot of bare peat to getting that surface roughness back and taking out the drains. If you're in a scenario where the habitat's vegetated, it's not in the best condition and it could be improved, that's where your flood benefits are going to be much more limited. It's definitely something there's ongoing research in that area, and it's something that we're looking at as part of the Cubes project. But what we're seeing in that project is that in intact peatlands, the intact peatland has fairly limited capacity to buffer flood events in winter and when the water table is high. If you think about it, effectively the bucket's full, you add more water, it's going to spill over. But where you can change that balance from being a very badly damaged site to getting the vegetation back, that's when most of your benefits can happen.
Very good. Well, I'll let you take a break there, catch your breath. It's a good hour that we put in there. I'm just going to discuss some of the upcoming events with CIWEM Northern Ireland and a couple of the other surrounding branches as well. Because they're all online, it's a really, really good opportunity to actually see what's happening across GB and ROI. So the first one, it's a CIWEM NI event on the 18th of February. This event will be joint with the Institute of Water Northern Ireland branch, and will be on the recently constructed Lough Fay Clear Water Basement. For those of you that aren't aware of it, Lough Fay Water Treatment Works supplies approximately 24,000 NI water customers, with the Lough Fay Clear Water Basin south supplying over 10,000 people in Cookstown and surrounding rural areas. So the talk will be discussing the recently constructed clear water basin on lands situated outside Cookstown, County Tyrone, increasing the existing storage capacity and providing security supply to potable water distribution network. So this project, or this presentation, will be given by Mark McAvoy of RPS, Mark Richardson of Northern Ireland Water, and Mark Little of Graham's. So 3 marks. So 17th of February, there's an event for the Welsh branch, which will be mini presentations. So it's research into fluvial and coastal waters. The 22nd of February 2021 is the adaptation reports best practice, a climate emergency adaptation net zero digital series. So that's available online as well, details of which are available on the CIWEM website. The 3rd of March is another NI ROI talk. It'll be a technical talk on climate change in Ireland, a coastal perspective. So we'll be joined by Christopher Calder. This presentation will discuss the potential impact of future climate change on coastal communities across the island of Ireland. Examples of coastal regions already affected by coastal erosion or flooding will be discussed in the context of high-level management policies in Ireland. Definitely an interesting talk. The 10th of March, there is an ROI event, which actually aligns quite nicely with your talk, Francis. It'll be on CIWEM's Climate Change Emergency Adaptation Net Zero Digital Series. It'll be hosted by the CIWEM ROI branch, and it will have speakers from Board Ammonia, Irish Water, and the Irish Wind Energy Association and others. Back to NI on the 16th of March, we will be hosting the new members papers competition. So the event is now closed to applicants, and we have had a massive response this year. So it closed at the end of the month of January, and we've had quite a large interest in it. So all the papers will be submitted by the 19th of February, and then there will be a panel of 3 judges who will shortlist this into 4 papers, and the final will be held on the 16th of March via Zoom. All papers will be based on my theme for the year, which is water and the environment adapting to change. So it's definitely a really, really good event to actually tune into. And it's a really good event for future participants, for anyone that wants to gain an opportunity to gain experience in publishing and presenting a paper. So it's worth keeping in mind for next year as well, if you're interested. It's an annual event. So all of our events are held in are advertised on the CIWEM website, and all the NI events are published on our social media platforms. That is CIWEM_NI on Twitter, and the CIWEM Northern Ireland branch on LinkedIn. So if you follow us there, you can keep up to date on what's going on. So just in closing, I'd like to give a note of thanks to Francis Mackin here for joining us and giving an absolutely fantastic presentation on peatland restoration in Ireland. I myself am from County Longford, surrounded by bogs, and on a clear summer day from the top of the Ardagh Mountain, you just really appreciate how much bogland we are surrounded by. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the restoration plans of Bord na Móna in the future. So it's really, really good. But yeah, and also a thank you for all of the 120 odd people that joined us today for supporting this event. As I noted earlier, all of our events are available on the CIWEM website, the recordings, and also on the YouTube page. So you can go back and enjoy this presentation again if you wish. And also to Barbara in the CIWEM headquarters for coordinating this event and all the events and the hard work she's doing there. So that's pretty much all from us. I'm going to close the talk at that. So thank you very much, and stay safe.